Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 4th of June, I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 466 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce today's guests, and then together we will take a look at the past week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. 20 people, including 5 children, were injured from a Russian missile explosion that hit a 2-story residential building near the central Ukrainian city of Dnipro yesterday. Sergei Luhansk, the regional governor, said rescuers pulled residents out from under the rubble and that 3 of the children were in a serious condition. A total of 17 people were being treated in hospital as a result. Ukraine is ready to launch its long-awaited counter-offensive to recapture Russian-occupied territory, Volodymyr Zelensky said in an interview that was published yesterday. The Ukrainian president said, "We strongly believe that we will succeed. I don't know how long it will take, but we are going to do it, and we are ready." Ukraine's plans for the counter-offensive remained on track, the Deputy Defence Minister Vladimir Haralov said yesterday, despite the unprecedented wave of missile and drone attacks across the country in recent weeks. Ukraine's counter-offensive plan is very impressive and can succeed, according to the US General David Petraeus. The Russian mercenary leader Evgeny Prigozhin has said that Kremlin factions are destroying the state by trying to sow discord between him and Chechen fighters. Prigozhin also said that he was ready to send fighters to the Belgorod region, which borders Ukraine and has been coming under intense shelling. 2 people were killed and 2 injured by Ukrainian artillery fire on Belgorod yesterday, said the regional governor Vyacheslav Gladkov. The Kyrgyzstan president, Sadir Japarov, has said that his ex-Soviet republic was ready to work with the EU to resolve shared problems, encourage dialogue, and to find lasting solutions. Ukraine has dismissed an Indonesian proposed peace plan for the war in Ukraine, which called for a demilitarized zone and a UN referendum in disputed territory. The Kremlin has banned Western journalists from the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which begins on the 14th of June. The UK's Ministry of Defence has said the withdrawal deployment of once elite Russian VDV troops to Bakhmut amid the withdrawal of Wagner mercenary forces means the whole Russian force is likely to be less flexible in reacting to operational challenges. During an inspection of more than 4,800 shelters, 252 were locked and a further 893 were unfit for use, according to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. And Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has said that Russia will come back to full compliance with the New START nuclear arms control treaty if Washington abandons its hostile stance towards Moscow. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this afternoon by 2 regular contributors to Broadcasting Scotland. Simon Barrow is the Director of Politics, Ethics and Beliefs at the think tank Ekklesia and is the editor and author of 5 books on Scottish politics, most recently A Better Nation, The Challenges of Scottish Independence. Simon, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Very well. There is sunshine on Leith. Good to be with you again.
Absolutely is. Thanks, Simon. And Huw Marshall was the founder of The National in Wales. He also founded Anwen Wales and Talking Wales, which is a new national news service for Wales. Huw is also an expert in digital strategy, content creation and marketing support. He's a regular contributor to Broadcasting Scotland, providing the view from Cymru. Huw, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
I'm very well, and as you can see, the sun always shines on Wales.
I don't believe that for a second. Thanks, Huw. Let's move to our first story this afternoon, because the UK government taking the COVID inquiry to court is definitely not a cover-up. On the 13th of June, the public inquiry into the handling of the pandemic by Westminster will start taking evidence. A procession of those at the heart of that government's decision-taking and blunder-making will be interrogated under oath about their actions and inactions. Heather Hallett, the retired judge in the chair, is said to be disappointed that she did not make Lord Chief Justice in England, but surely there is no more significant role in her career than investigating, passing judgment and drawing lessons from the performance of the government during the deadliest peacetime emergency in more than a century. Her inquisition is not going to be a dry and bloodless exercise. She's adopting a take-no-prisoners approach, and we know that from the advanced questions the inquiry team have been sending out to those who will be examined. One question to Boris Johnson goes, in or around autumn 2020, did you state that you would rather let the bodies pile high than order another lockdown, or words to that effect? Another question says, please confirm whether in March 2020 or around that period, you suggested to senior civil servants that you be injected with COVID-19 on television to demonstrate to the public that it did not pose a threat. Lady Hallett intends to bring an intense scrutiny to the conduct of Johnson and other leaders, and also the calibre of the UK state as a whole during the pandemic. Some of the participants might emerge with their status burnished. Others have ample reason to be fearful of the impact on their reputations of the remorseless evidence gathering about the many things that went wrong during the crisis. Tories are said to be shivering that the inquiry, which is not due to complete its oral hearings until the summer of 2026, will haunt the party for years to come. Of course, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. A comprehensive inquest into the pandemic is essential to improve the chances of avoiding or mitigating a repeat of the human, social and economic calamities inflicted by COVID-19. Some have been questioning the purpose of the inquiry, saying that the lessons have already been learned. But I would say that at Westminster and in Whitehall, lesson learning has taken a very distant third place to arse covering and excuse mongering. The inside accounts we have been provided with so far from the likes of Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock have been self-promoting and self-serving, so the inquiry is the opportunity to gather testimony from the full cast of witnesses and compel the production of the entirety of the evidence. Without that, we won't get what we need, which is an understanding of why so many vital arms of the state cracked under the pressure of the pandemic, and the Westminster Centre was often in complete meltdown. And I think it's also worth remembering, looking at the numbers of those who passed away from COVID as at December 2020, and these are numbers from the Financial Times, the number of people who died per 100,000 of populations in Japan was 43, in New Zealand was 67, in Scotland was 226, in Wales was 256, in the EU generally was 264, and in England was 311. The death toll in England was 7 times higher than in Japan. So, my apologies for that lengthy introduction to the first story this afternoon, but I felt that the numbers bear repeating, and I won't stop repeating them, and the issue is a large one here. And also, I'll get it off my chest as well. It appears that at the moment we're suffering from the incompetent cover-up of the covering up of incompetence during the pandemic, which is not a good thing. So, firstly, Angela Rayner, the Labour's deputy leader, has accused Rishi Sunak of being hopelessly distracted with legal ploys to obstruct the COVID inquiry in a desperate attempt to withhold evidence. She's accused him of a cover-up, and she says that instead of digging himself further into a hole by pursuing doomed legal tactics to conceal the truth, Rishi Sunak must comply with the COVID inquiry's request for evidence in full. So, Simon, coming to you first of all, is Angela Rayner correct? Is she right when she says that Sunak must stop digging a hole and must comply with the evidence, with the inquiry's requests for all of the evidence?
Well, obviously, she's correct that all of the evidence is needed, and the UK government has to act quickly and with transparency. I mean, it's worth remembering the backdrop to this, which is that taxpayers in the UK have already forked out £220,000 to cover Boris Johnson's legal fees after the Partygate scandal to test whether or not he misled Parliament. And then, of course, because lawyers try to act in an ethical way, they then made certain facts evident in public which he didn't like, and he ends up dropping his own lawyers and looking potentially to sue his own lawyers. Now the UK government is planning to spend money, it appears, in order to restrict the amount of information that's available to Lady Hallett, who, of course, was the first woman to chair the Bar Council, extremely well-respected person. So it's going to take a judicial review against the independent inquiry that it set up itself, not just potentially to protect Johnson, but also, of course, there are other people who might be affected by that. You've mentioned Rishi Sunak. I mean, the whole question of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that he set up seems to have gone against most of the evidence received at the time, and we might find out some sort of juicy details about that. But also there are plans potentially to try legally to stop some of the evidence going to the inquiry being available to the grieving relatives of people who died during the pandemic. I mean, this is absolutely shocking. And I think the sort of final point to make is that this is important because it's part of a wider issue about degenerating trust in public institutions and government, because they constantly try to use the law not to actually increase their accountability and transparency, but to deny it. And also because the World Health Organization has said that the likelihood is that we could face yet another serious pandemic in the coming years, and therefore actually learning the lessons is vital. And also, of course, then there's the wider question about the use of public money, the £38 billion spent on preventative equipment, who that actually went to, what the tie-ins are between government, the Conservative Party, donors, and so on. All of those things are absolutely vital. So, yes, of course, complete disclosure and transparency is important, and Lady Hallett should be trusted to decide what's relevant and what's not relevant to that. It shouldn't be down to the government to decide that kind of thing and attempt to mark its own homework.
Thanks, Simon. That's absolutely right. It certainly struck me, I was thinking about this, that we are, by definition, we are getting closer to the next pandemic. And we ought to be acting accordingly. Huw, Simon mentioned there both the financial situation and also the interests of those who lost loved ones during the pandemic. Rivka Gottlieb, who's the spokesperson for the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, said it was absolutely obscene that the Cabinet Office is going to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money on suing its own public inquiry into being unable to access critical evidence. Some might say that the interests and the concerns of those who were bereaved during the pandemic seem hardly to feature in the thinking in Westminster. Is that a reasonable approach, or are we misconstruing the way in which the government is responding, in particular to the interests of those who lost loved ones?
I think it's one of the things I think that this is showing is the focus is going to be on the Westminster response and the Conservative government. And I know in Wales, that there's a Welsh bereavement group of people who lost loved ones to COVID during COVID, who are asking for a Welsh specific inquiry, which the Welsh government, the Welsh Labour government, have refused so far. And the Plaid Cymru, the Conservatives, I think all the opposition parties are calling for a separate inquiry, because I think it's clear now from whatever Baroness Hallett is doing, it is going to focus on the response in England, and I think we deserve answers in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland as well. I personally, my mother died during COVID. Not it wasn't COVID related, but obviously it was in the middle of lockdown, which meant that myself and my wife and children, we had to watch the funeral on a video recording 6 hours after it took place. So when you see it being trivialized by government and by ministers, just doing their utmost to block, bluster, and it's so distasteful, it's so disrespectful, and it's come to the point now. We mentioned this previously. We're seeing the death throes of a Conservative government, and I think it's also the death throes of the Conservative Party, because they have become this almost extreme right wing rump of conservatism, and it's sad to see, but that they're just trying to sort of exonerate themselves, cover themselves as much as they can, because obviously when the truth comes out, it's not it's not going to look good for them.
Absolutely right. Thanks, Huw. And Simon, just finally on this topic, Lord Kerslake, who's a former head of the civil service, has urged the government to back down and hand everything over to Lady Hallett that she's asked for. He told The Independent that they, the government, are in a hole and should stop digging, really. They should take a step back and think of the court of public opinion. Now, it struck me that the approach that we're seeing a little bit from Westminster here is that it's consistent insofar as the normal rules of behaviour and conduct don't only apply to the little people and the taxpayers, not to those in power. So, do you think, does the court of opinion hold much sway at the moment with those who occupy Downing Street and Westminster?
Well, I think those who occupy Downing Street and Westminster make the calculation in electoral terms at the end of the day. So the court of public opinion is a limited one in terms of, how can we survive? How can we win? Hugh's absolutely right to point out that the focus of all of this is on Westminster. At one level, that's absolutely right, because clearly many of the things that went wrong that are going to be revealed by this inquiry are things that went badly wrong at Westminster. And I mean, obviously, England is the land of my birth. I had friends down south who actually wanted to watch the Scottish briefings rather than the UK briefings, because at least they felt that they were getting both an honest reflection of what was happening and also better and solid advice, at least attempting to follow the science. So, which public are we talking about is very important, but it is important also that there are proper inquiries into what happened in Wales and what happened in Scotland. The speculation in the media this morning that the Scottish government will follow what's happening at Westminster in terms of trying to block access to material, I think, that's obviously some people in the media are going to try and enjoy that one and so on. I hope the Scottish government and the Welsh government will behave very differently in relation to this and make transparency. And obviously people will have made mistakes, and we recognise that in the midst of a crisis like that, mistakes will have been made. But really, the question is, how did people behave in relation to evidence? What was the basis on which they made decisions? Was it a kind of populism or a political calculation, or was the health of the people put first? And then, of course, because I mentioned that the court of public opinion is being affected by political factors, also the role of political parties is important in that. I mentioned the wider issue of trust earlier in the week. I was saying that actually I think that the finance and governance and conduct of political parties ought also to be subject to independent scrutiny. And so that's something else I think that we should look at. There are a lot of wider ramifications. This is a rock in a pool which will produce many ripples.
That's a very good point, Simon. Absolutely spot on. Thank you. I'm grateful to you both for your thoughts on that first item this afternoon. But we'll move on now to our next item, because Thursday last week was a bit of a Groundhog Day. Punxsutawney Gordon came out of his hole again this week and predicted radical change to the UK Constitution, including abolishing the House of Lords and federalism again, and then he'd return to his hole. Gordon Brown claimed that the people must move away from nationalism and towards patriotism. The former Labour leader was speaking at a pro-union rally, which the dark money think tank he founded, Our Scottish Future, was hosting in Edinburgh last Thursday. Our Scottish Future quoted Brown as saying, "We've got to move on from 19th century nationalism to 21st century patriotism." So firstly, does anyone have any idea of what that is meant to mean? Simon, any ideas?
Well, I mean, it won't surprise viewers of Broadcasting Scotland when I say that it appears that, Gordon is able to see nationalism in other people, but not in himself. And his own, implacable commitment, it seems, to the United Kingdom and the British state. It's really quite interesting that bits of the left in Britain have apparently a completely uncritical approach to the British state, or somehow think that it's going to be in the interests of workers to prop it up at all costs. So, I mean, obviously, this is a rhetorical advice to try and drive a wedge between his own perspective in defending the union and the case for Scottish independence. But, I mean, I'm going to try and be fair here and say that the one thing about the recent gathering of Labour leaders to talk about the union is that they were actually talking about a case for the union, which normally unionists don't do. They simply slag off independence and say that Scotland will go to hell in a handbasket. But what is the union actually for? So they've started to introduce slogans about solidarity and security and so on. But what will that mean in practice? What will federalism mean in practice when one country is 85% of the population and a big part of the territory that's being covered and so on? And the Brown Commission raised some interesting ideas, but it doesn't address the fundamental question. If you end up, for example, having a Chamber of the Nations in place of the House of Lords, Scotland and Wales will still be a small minority. Scotland has been ruled by the Tories for nearly 40 years from Westminster, but hasn't actually voted for them in a majority sense for well over 60 years. The democratic deficit will remain. Likewise, the Brown Commission talked about borrowing powers going to Scotland. Well, that would be good. Not nearly as far as the sort of promise of the strongest devolved parliament in the world that was made after the 2014 referendum, but we're moving steps in that direction. But borrowing powers without full economic powers is basically a license to go into debt. So there are so many holes in this, but at least they're talking about it, and it feels to me that it's really important that actually we have a bigger conversation in Scotland about our constitutional future. I think we should be thinking about a constitutional convention, which brings people with all different ideas together to enable not only facts to be tested, but also the Scottish public, civic society to become much more involved in the debate. So it's not just a sort of political football being kicked around by politicians, because if anything's going to shift us towards independence, it's that greater understanding and that greater participation.
That's a very good point, and something that I've heard people discussing over the last few days in a number of different settings, but that precise point. But Huw, coming to you, as I said, Gordon Brown was quoted by his think tank as saying, we've got to move on from 19th century nationalism to 21st century patriotism. Do you have any idea what he means?
No, and as you just said now, he doesn't know either. It is this thing about sort of Welsh nationalism, Scottish nationalism, and by that understanding, English nationalism being bad things. So yeah, British nationalism is wonderful and and is glorious, and we should all embrace it. But like I say, you do get this feeling, it's almost like every 6 months he pops up somewhere, with a rehash of what he was doing. But I think what's interesting here is the dynamic, because, you had Andy Burnham, you had Mark Drakeford, who were both quite progressive within the Labour Party. And last week as well, I don't know if you know that Mark Drakeford, Prif Weinidog, the First Minister in Wales, met Hamza Yousaf, and they had a very positive meeting regarding, the importance of protecting devolution with those governments. So it's strange that Drakeford is having a positive and open discussion with Yousaf and the SNP, whilst the Labour Party in Scotland and in England are just are obsessed with demonising them. So there's mixed messages going on here, and as the point you've made, with federalism, great. You know what I mean? If you can get federalism, that's a step forward from what we currently have. But as you say, 85% of the population, live in England. They're the ones who vote in Conservative governments. I'm proud to say that, unlike Scotland, Wales has never voted a Conservative majority. So again, it's one of these issues, and I think people forget as well. But the union going back, it goes back, centuries. At the time when the union was, sort of being put together over those years, there was some parity between the nations of, England, Scotland, and Wales from a population point of view. And it's in, recent times, the last, 200 years, that the population of England has, exploded. And that's why we're in a position now where it doesn't work, and people seem to forget that the fact that at one point, yes, we were more equal, far more equal than we are now. And I think that the elephant in the room is that 85%. You can't. How are England going to cede equal powers to Wales and Scotland, and have an equal say in things when they have such a large population? I doubt that many countries would give away that power.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hugh. Now, of course, the Gorgon has formed for this kind of thing. Ahead of the 2014 independence referendum, he urged people in Scotland to vote against independence and instead to back his plans. He said that the UK would be as close as a federal state as you can be within a year or two. Specifically, on the 15th of August 2014, he said, "I can understand how people are sceptical when promises are made. We're going to be, within a year or two, as close to a federal state as you can be in a country where one nation is 85% of the population." So he acknowledged the challenges there. Commenting this week, Jamie Hebburn MSP has said, "On the eve of the 2014 referendum, Gordon Brown made promises that would have made even snake oil salesmen blush. In contrast to what Gordon Brown promised, the reality is that we are about as far from a federal state as you can get, and nothing that pro-Brexit Labour are proposing in their anemic devolution proposals will make any difference." He continued, "Jobs have been lost and living standards have been harmed because promises that Gordon Brown made were not kept, and he needs to apologise." So, Simon, Jamie Hebburn said the reality is we're about as far from a federal state as you can get, and nothing in the anemic devolution proposals will make any difference. Is that the reality?
Well, I think it has an overarching truth. I think there might be a slight danger in saying that no reforms are going to make any difference at all. That's not true, because I think also it's important that for example, Scotland has acquired some social security powers and is doing something with them which is really, really important, which is developing the seeds of its own system based on dignity and human rights and participation of people actually affected. A very, very different system. So I'm quite keen, actually, that we try to look at the maximum use of powers and the maximum acquisition of powers to begin to create the policies and the infrastructure which actually point towards independence and show what it can be looked like. So there's a slight danger in that kind of rhetoric that you sort of write everything off. And as I said, for example, the Brown Commission talks about the question of borrowing powers to Scotland. That would be good. But as I've also pointed out, without economic powers, that's a recipe for debt. So there are lots of traps involved in all of this. But overall, of course, that's true, because it's important, I think, to look at what the Tory government at Westminster is doing and what the Labour Party is doing. The Tory government is really taking a dagger approach to this. It's looking to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act 98 to question, well, first of all, of course, gender reform, but there may be other things that come under that. That, of course, was part of the devolution settlement, but it illustrates the severe limits of devolution. And it's also the Internal Market Act is being invoked. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, I think. And also, there's an attempt to try and stop foreign trade missions and other sorts of things. So, really the dagger is being used against Scotland, and I think will be used more. Meanwhile, what we're getting from Labour is lots of rhetoric about moving at least in something of a right direction. But will Keir Starmer really embrace this at all? He seems to have swung over to supporting Brexit. He's refusing to take action, or saying he won't take any action on anti-union laws and many other laws which are a severe danger to democracy in the UK. He won't shift on proportional representation and wants to maintain an undemocratic system. He wants to maintain Trident and the obscene amount of money spent on that. Is the Labour Party really the answer? Because underlying the sort of Brown approach really is, elect a Labour government and everything will absolutely be fine. But last point to pick up is about Mark Drakeford. I was interested by Hugh's comments on that, because it appears that Mark Drakeford actually had a pretty constructive relationship with Nicola Sturgeon. I think he's going to have a constructive relationship with the new First Minister as well. And I think he does have a genuine commitment to preserving devolution and is prepared to be outspoken about that. I think he may have a bit more of an open mind than he would reveal in public about the future of the UK, because the future I'd like to see is independent nations, more autonomous regions. And then we can look at confederal ways of, what is it that we can do together, but on the basis of real equality and self-determination. So I think there are really good ways forward, but I don't think Labour is really looking in that kind of direction at all. It just wants to kind of thwart independence for Scotland and Wales.
Yep, and take power. Thank you, Simon. That's grand. And yes, we'll move on now to our next item, which does touch on the Internal Market Act in the UK and the situation that the Scottish and Welsh, and I think also Northern Ireland governments find themselves in. Because 5 years ago, the UK government agreed a memorandum with the devolved administrations, the governments in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, on the introduction of deposit return schemes, which included glass bottles. Now the Scottish Government deposit return scheme is ready to go. The UK government has used the UK Single Market Act to block it. And I'm wondering whether the UK Single Market Act should be renamed the English Single Market Act. But speaking as he took part in a National Day of Action, our First Minister said that an increasingly unpredictable and erratic Westminster government was making it harder to make Scotland a better place to live, to work, and to do business. His comments follow the revelation that Simon mentioned there from the First Minister of Wales, that the Welsh Government has received a letter from the UK Government ripping up a previous commitment to respect Welsh devolution on the issue and warning them that they must also comply with the UK's unilateral decision to remove glass from their scheme, whenever that scheme actually emerges. Campaigning in Glasgow Pollock, Mr Youssef said, "The people of Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament, and that Parliament has made Scotland a better and fairer country. But it's now clear that devolution is not a one-way street. An increasingly unpredictable and erratic Westminster government is stepping in on a whim to unilaterally block decisions taken by the elected Scottish Parliament. And make no mistake, the attempts to sabotage the deposit return scheme are the thin end of the wedge. This is not the first time, and it will not be the last time, the Tories try to trample all over the Scottish Parliament." So, Huw, before we get into the broader constitutional issues which this particular item has highlighted, the point has been made repeatedly this week that Westminster has changed direction or has stepped in at the last minute and in a way that contradicts the approach that Westminster was previously indicating it would take. So, Huw, why do you think we are seeing this opposition from Westminster, and why do you think it is so late in the day?
I think it's all part of their tactics for damage limitation at the next general election, to be honest. That their focus now is to ensure that they're not completely wiped out. If you look at polling that's been done in recent weeks and months, it's showing that the potential the Conservatives could be down to sort of double digit in MPs. So they're focusing on small votes, showing that they have a power over the other nations, and it's part of this posturing, because they know that their best chances at the next election is to appeal to that base. Because remember, there's still 1 in 4, almost 1 in 3, who will vote Conservative or for a right wing party like Brexit or Reform or whatever that those parties are now, and they are campaigning on specifically sort of quite right wing issues. Britain, and by default, England having control over these upstarts who want to do their own thing, and if they could, they would be rolling back devolution, and they've tried to do that with Brexit, with the power, with the monies that used to come from Europe into Wales and Scotland, making sure that comes through them and that they decide where that goes. So I genuinely think that they're in this pre-election footing now, and they're just trying to come up with things that they know that will appeal to that base, who dislike anything progressive or positive, or anything that would harm the union.
Thanks, Huw. And Simon, one other question on the nitty-gritty. My apologies. One other question on the detail aspect of this conflict with regard to the deposit return scheme. Before we look at the broader constitutional issues, which we'll get to in a moment, why do you think that Westminster has only now suddenly wants to exclude glass from the schemes that are being promoted in Scotland and Wales? Is it just opportunistic grievance mongering by Westminster?
Well, I think the answer is fairly straightforward, which is without a significant component like glass, it isn't going to work properly. So, what they want, I agree with you, it's about political calculations for schemes in Wales and Scotland not to work effectively, and therefore to be able to to make some political capital out of that. I think it's as crude as that at the end of the day. It's also about exercising power. It's also about saying who's boss. It's also about saying, yes, Scotland and Wales have to adapt to what's going on in England, not the other way round. And so it's very much about putting us in our place in that sense. And of course, it's in the context in which the UK has replaced the security of being in a market of 500 million people, 500 million people, which was of course, the 1986 European single market, which ironically Margaret Thatcher played a significant role in happening, and replacing it with the UK Internal Market Act of 2020, which the Institute of Government of Others has said will always raise concerns about the impact on devolved policy making. And this is what we are seeing. And Huw is quite right. It's political calculation to do with the next election. But that's an uncertain territory as well. And of course, Labour is playing the same game. And, we've just been talking a few moments ago about the Brown Commission and about Labour leaders coming together to look at reviving the union. And that's about trying to retain votes in Wales, but particularly in Scotland. So both the major Westminster parties are on manoeuvres in relation to their own interests and their own future. And really, they're running over the real concerns around the deposit return scheme, which is about protecting the environment and about progressive legislation in which, if we had a partnership of equals, things that are done in Scotland and Wales that show a pathway to the future and a better future would be welcomed as part of that partnership. Instead, there are attempts to block them.
Thanks, Simon. And it was a good turn of phrase from you there. Thank you. That the unionist parties are on manoeuvres, and to bring this item to a head, the First Minister has now written to the Prime Minister urging him to revoke the UK government's rejection of glass in Scotland's DRS by by tomorrow. The First Minister said the UK's government's demands, including the removal of glass from the scheme, would impact the environment, detrimentally affect businesses based in Scotland, and threaten the viability of the scheme. He wrote, "There are much wider consequences of your decision. This UK government intervention at such a late stage demonstrates a major erosion of the devolution settlement. I urge you to revoke the conditions set out in your letter and grant the exclusion for Scotland's DRS to be implemented as per the regulations agreed by the Scottish Parliament in this area of devolved competence. Without this, the Scottish Government is not prepared to put Scottish businesses at a competitive disadvantage due to the last-minute demands the UK Government has made. There is little doubt," he went on, "your Government's action has put the future of DRS in grave danger, not only in Scotland, but also in the rest of the UK, due to the damage to consumer and investor confidence." So, Simon, you were talking about the unionist parties being on manoeuvres, and this is simply the latest of those manoeuvres, it could be argued. So in a broader sense, do you think at the moment our Scottish voters in Scotland, are they accepting at the moment of Viceroy Alistair Union Jack overruling the decisions of the Scottish Parliament simply because he feels like it and he wants to be on manoeuvres?
Well, it's difficult to give a definite answer to that. I mean, one potential measure of it, of course, is the fact that recent poll on the question of independence showed a shift towards independence at the same time as the SNP has taken a hit in its polls because of sort of the upheaval going on within the party. And that would indicate that people are looking slightly separately to issues about political parties on the one hand and the broader question of Scottish self-determination on the other hand. So I think, people are concerned. Most people don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about these things in detail, and the detail can be quite arcane. And of course, the deposit return scheme in Scotland has taken a massive hit from the media, not least the Tory media. There've been a whole lot of stooshes about, how it's been prepared, the adequacy of the legislation, industry complaining about aspects of it, and so on. So really, I think what the UK government is doing is trying to take advantage of that. They come in at the last minute with this stuff because they're not really paying any attention to Scotland and don't really care about it. And then they suddenly think, oh yeah, we don't like that, or we can get a political advantage out of that, so we'll block things. And one wonders about the entire concept of deposit return and the environmental impact about that, how much they actually care about that either. So, I think political calculations are playing a major role in that. But yes, I mean, people in Scotland, those of us who live in Scotland, need to wake up even more to the extent to which powers are being eroded and the devolution settlement is not being honoured in its own right, and the extent to which its inherent limitations are showing as well.
Absolutely, thank you, Simon. And Huw, finally on this point, do you think the UK Internal Market Act should be renamed the English Single Market Act?
Well, yeah, it is exactly that, isn't it? And that's the issue. And I think there's also the issue, as Simon pointed out, it's the fact that this stuff isn't being reported because it's difficult. They're going for the headlines. Around the glass. And one of the main focuses, obviously, when they report it, they don't mention the political aspect of it. They're saying, oh, from a glass perspective, it's going to impact business and it's going to have an economic effect. But nobody's challenging that in the media, and this is where the issue is how people come to make informed decisions when they do go to the ballot box. Because the same situation is here in Wales. Support for independence appears to be creeping up. Now it's around 1 in 3, whereas a few years ago it was 1 in 10. But support for Plaid Cymru hasn't gone up, and if anything, it's regressed. And again, Plaid Cymru has faced internal issues. Adam Price, the leader, stood down recently. And we got a leadership contest, potentially in the offing. So again, I think people separate these issues. Polling shows in Wales that the majority of Labour voters support independence. They wouldn't vote for independence tomorrow, but the idea of Wales being independent, they support the concept of that. But it's important, it's getting those steps to independence, because Wales, remember, is far behind Scotland. We don't have our own legal system. Our devolved powers are limited to health, education, transport. Basically, the devolved government of Wales is the administration for whoever is in power in Westminster.
Thanks, Huw. That's some great perspective. We'll move on now, though, because Transport Scotland has unveiled plans for its preferred option of building a £470 million debris flow shelter to protect the A83's Rest and Be Thankful section in Argyll. The scheme comprises a 1.4 kilometre long open-sided tunnel costed at between £405 and £470 million. Its selection follows design and assessment work on 5 options. A debris flow shelter is akin to a tunnel with one open side and is a recognised means of protecting transport infrastructure and its users from falling rock and debris in areas susceptible to debris flows or landslides. Debris flow shelters have been successfully used across Europe and beyond for many years. The other options included 2 435 and 300 metre viaducts at either end of a realigned road and a 2.3 kilometre long debris flow shelter, constructing a 1.8 kilometre viaduct that would run the entire length of the route with piers designed to withstand the impact of a landslide, a hybrid solution featuring a 1.5 kilometre viaduct for the first part of the route and a 1 kilometre tunnel at the end, and also a 2.9 kilometre full-length tunnel. Cost estimates in 2020 ranged from £268 million for the debris flow shelter option and £860 million for the full-length tunnel. However, at today's prices, the costs are likely to have risen considerably. So, Simon, firstly, why has it taken something like 50 years to get to a stage where the Scottish Government, Transport Scotland, has finally selected its preferred option for fixing the permanent problem which the Rest and Be Thankful presents to people trying to use the road?
Well, I mean, part of the answer to that is that, governments are usually pressured in terms of spending. There are debates around prioritising of public money and so on, and infrastructure projects, taking long-term care of your infrastructure, often come out second best in relation to that. That's a political reality. It's also part of the consequence of having a political system where, naturally governments will change every few years and so on. So long-term thinking is not incentivized by that. And there's an interesting question as to what could incentivize better long-term planning in relation to that. So, that's why we're in the situation that we're in. And obviously, this is something that needs major attention. The A83 junction with the B828 has a commemorative stone actually in the area that will be affected by this, that was actually set up by workers who built the original military road, which came in 1753. And the slogan on it is "Rest and be thankful." And I suspect a lot of people who are having to cope with this are not feeling either rested or thankful about the situation, and a solution is absolutely needed. But I should declare a further interest here, which is that I don't drive; I use public transport, and have for all of my life. And there are also very serious questions about infrastructure for public transport as well. For example, I do use the line between Edinburgh and Stirling, and in the winter, and when there's flooding, often banks can collapse and there can be problems on that line and on other lines in the central belt. There's the whole question of the connectivity of the Highlands and so on, and how you do that. And there's the overarching environmental need to have a massive investment and shift towards public transport solutions and so on. So again, this betokens much bigger issues.
Thanks, Simon. And Huw, pivoting for a moment to look at the perspective from Cymru, decisions on whether to continue 55 North Wales road projects have been delayed. This was back in December last year, with the Welsh Government blaming capital budget cuts in Westminster. That followed the Welsh Government's decision in June last year to halt all road schemes in Wales not yet under construction until each one had been assessed by its new Climate Change Ministry. The Deputy Minister for Climate Change, Lee Waters, has then said that decisions on the schemes, which included the third Menai crossing, have been put back from the original November deadline due to an 8% reduction to capital funding in Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement last year. Lee Waters went on, the Roads Review makes recommendations about future transport policy, as well as judging the 55 road schemes in the current pipeline. Responding to the recommendations is complex, and that has been further complicated by a significant reduction in our spending power following the UK government's financial crash. He said as well as the third Menai crossing, the 55 projects in question include the A55 roundabouts removal scheme at Llanfyrfechan and elsewhere, and also the Llanbedr bypass. Government officials have asked to fast-track the removal of the roundabouts and the Llanbedr scheme, but both were halted after recommendations for the new climate-focused Roads Review panel. So Huw, two questions, one of which you can answer. Why is the infrastructure investment in Scotland, Wales and the north of Ireland so difficult? And do the broad shoulders of the Union mean that we all have to share in such useless underinvestment in basic transport infrastructure?
Yeah, I think, when you look at the situation in Wales, I think it's commendable, the road review that's been carried out on environmental grounds, because sustainability, we can't continue to be using cars at the level that that we currently do. But that means, as Simon says, you need public transport infrastructure that works. I'm from the north originally. I used to travel from Wrexham to Carnarvon. I used to commute on a daily basis for a period and use the A55, and it's a nightmare road, and especially in the summer when there's holiday traffic, it's a problem route. But doing the same journey by train, is a challenge as well. So unless the alternatives are there, taking people off roads is going to be hard. And obviously, the COVID funding that was put in place for bus services, that's coming to an end in June. So I think it's a bit odd that Welsh government are saying, we're going to stop investing in new roads until we've done a review, but then not making sure that the public transport is available to cover people during that time. So I think again it's a case of the Welsh government showing that this is what we can do. They're prioritising the environment, which obviously they should do, but then the flip side is they don't seem to have thought through the rest of it when it comes to buses and trains, because obviously the Welsh government, the Transport for Wales, was taken into sort of control by the Welsh government, and things that the state of the rolling stock is improving slowly, but services, you go on Twitter on a daily basis, it's still awful. There's lots of bits of the network that just aren't open at the moment, and covered by bus replacement services that just don't turn up. And again, when it comes to road building, they may have put new roads on pause, but there's still there's huge road building going on the heads of the valleys, the route that goes across the top of the South Wales valleys. That's been ongoing for decades, and it's still ongoing.
Thanks, Huw. That's some good perspective from Cymru. Thank you. We'll move on to our final item this afternoon, because the SFA agreed to move the kick-off time of the Scottish Cup final yesterday in order to allow BBC One to broadcast the English FA Cup final to viewers in Scotland. The Hampden match between Celtic and Inverness yesterday was moved from 3 to 5:30 to avoid a clash with the FA Cup final at Wembley. Holyrood Sports Committee said the move set a dangerous precedent for other major sporting events. The SFA said later that the kick-off was a factor in having the match reach as wide an audience as possible. The SNP MSP Claire Hockey, the sports committee's convener, said that the move had caused considerable disruption for supporters who had already made travel plans. In a letter to the SFA chief exec, Ian Maxwell, she wrote, alongside the safety implications of a later kick-off time, there is also a concern that the decision sets a dangerous precedent for other major sporting events in Scotland and will be no less disruptive to the viewing public. She urged the SFA to reconsider its decision and return the traditional kick-off time of 3 o'clock. Both finalists in the Cup final said that they would have preferred the kick-off time to remain at 3 o'clock, but the Scottish FA preferred to move the showpiece Cup game, which was shown live on BBC Scotland and via Play. So, Simon, first of all, does this decision by the SFA to move the time tell us a little bit about the way in which the SFA really regards ticket buying and travelling fans?
Well, yes, I'm afraid it does. Again, I need to declare an interest here. I'm the co-founder and former chair of the Scottish Football Supporters Association, which is effectively the fans' union in Scotland. And it's clear that fans are really, unhappy with the fact that not just this match, but lots of matches are moved in terms of time. This provides all kinds of problems for transport, sometimes for accommodation. Let's face it, 60% of the income of Scottish football comes through the gate and through the expenditure of supporters going to matches. And that's a very large proportion of it. And yet the kind of business model for Scottish football is not organised according to the needs of those fans. The clubs involved, as you pointed out, are also unhappy with this. Yes, there's a consideration about getting the maximum TV audience, but then there's also a question about the revenues or lack of them coming into Scottish football from TV rights, and who takes decisions about these sorts of things. And of course, that's quite complicated now, because on the one hand, you have the football authorities who often don't take into account or actually have within their decision-making bodies supporters, the paying customers, and they ought to have a much larger role. There's going to be an issue raised later this month about the question of whether there should be independent regulation of the governance and the finance and the conduct of Scottish football. Similar moves happening in England at the moment. This issue might come partly under that umbrella, but it's important to realise that, for example, again, I was born in England. It would be absolutely unthinkable that the England national team wouldn't be shown on terrestrial television when it's playing important matches or even friendlies. But in Scotland, regularly, we don't see our national team. I have to pay money, other supporters have to pay money to a series of broadcasters in order just to watch our national team. And the 2024 Viaplay deal that's been negotiated under UEFA's National Association Media Rights and Sales process for the showing of the European qualifiers, that means that effectively UEFA takes control of the marketing and sale of broadcast rights for all 55 European nations, and Scotland and indeed Wales end up, right down the pecking order of that. And then there's also the question, of course, of adjusting our own football schedules according to the needs of broadcasters. And obviously there has to be some give and take in that. But again, how are the fans being consulted and what money is coming in? Because let's face it, when it comes to, the game, the Scottish Premiership, and so on, the amount of money coming into the game is the equivalent of a couple of English Premiership matches down south. So, we really are suffering in all kinds of ways, and the fans and supporters are suffering most.
Thanks, Simon. And Huw, a big question with a short amount of time left in the programme, so my apologies for this. But do you think, Huw, is this simply yet another? We were talking at the beginning of the programme about the respect agenda, or the lack of respect agenda. Is this decision to move the Scottish Cup final simply yet another example of why responsibility for broadcasting really should be devolved in order that the viewers are properly respected?
Well, yeah, because the BBC should have been broadcasting the Scottish Cup final. It was the English Cup final that was being played yesterday. Obviously the situation is different in Wales because obviously our top teams all play in the English pyramid. And our support for football in Wales, again on a national level with the National League is quite small. But what's interesting from a broadcasting perspective, we're quite fortunate in Wales, is that the Welsh FA and S4C have agreements in place to broadcast Wales matches free to air on S4C with Welsh language commentary. There's part of the stipulation is that they can't put the red button English commentary on, but it does make it accessible. But the issue with UEFA controlling that, there is a danger then that the other channels don't do that. But what's happened now, what was interesting, I think it was Amazon Prime when they had one of the games, they actually had Welsh language commentary as an option on there. So they're working their way around it, stopping the free to air by providing that commentary. But yeah, at the end of the day, fans are the last people they think about, because it's all about money these days. Sadly.
Absolutely. Thanks, Huw. I'm very grateful to you for those thoughts. And I must say, I've got to say also that I'm afraid that is all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the generous support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to develop the station and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Now, we will be back on Monday evening at 7 for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this afternoon, and of course I'd like to give very special thanks to our two very special guests, Huw Marshall and Simon Barrow. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Good to be with you.
I hope that you've enjoyed our programme this afternoon and that you have a very peaceful rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.